All right, I wanted to respond to this video that I just watched on YouTube, and it's put on by a Calvinist channel, and they're claiming here are two questions that a non-Calvinist can't answer. And so we're going to look at their assertions and then try to respond as we go forward here.
Many Christians today hold to the idea of free will and salvation, rejecting the doctrines of grace as taught in Reformed theology. However, this position often leads to significant logical inconsistencies when examined closely. In this discussion, we will consider two critical questions that expose these contradictions. Question 1. If free will exists, how do we pray for the lost without violating their free will?
Okay, we'll stop right there just to explain a little bit about some of the terms he's been using here. So when he's talking about free will, he's talking about what non-Calvinists assert, that is libertarian free will, that humans have the ability to choose between two options, perhaps. I guess in essence, it's really that humans are the source of their choices. But Calvinism rejects that humans are really free will agents. Instead, God is the one who has decreed or determined everything that comes to pass, which would include the free will choices, as they would call them, the choices of human beings. So everything that comes to pass, including every choice that human beings make, is part of the divine decree. Obviously, there are a lot of problems, I believe, that follow from this. Probably the most tragic would be that this makes God the author of all of the evil. All of the choices that men make that are evil is really God's choice, that they make that choice. I think that's thoroughly anti-biblical. He's got a couple of questions, and one is, how can non-Calvinists pray for other people to be saved without violating their free will? Now, he'll explain why he thinks that a non-Calvinist praying for a lost person might violate their free will.
Non-Calvinists frequently pray for their unbelieving friends and family in ways that contradict their own belief in free will. They ask God to open their eyes, soften their hearts, give them understanding, and draw them to himself. But if the unbeliever has autonomous free will, how can God do any of these things without violating that will?
Well, there's his question. And he's saying that whenever a non-Calvinist prays for an unsaved person, he's praying for things like God open their eyes or soften their hearts. And he mentioned a few of those things. And he says, but how can God do that without violating their free will? That is a strange question, in my opinion. It seems that this is something that nearly everybody tries to do who's trying to convince a girl to marry him. He's trying to show his love for her. He's trying to be nice to her and kind to her and persuade her to make a choice to be with him, to marry him, or whatever the case may be. But that's not violating her free will. That is trying to persuade her to make a free will choice in favor of him. Why is this person making this video? Is he trying to convince me and persuade me of the truthfulness of it? If so, is that violating my freedom to assess the truthfulness of his claims and the theology that's behind them? Is he violating my free will by trying to persuade me? This is a really strange alleged inconsistency from non-Calvinists.
If God is intervening in a way that influences their decision, then their choice is no longer truly free.
So there he says, if God is influencing their decision. God is influencing decisions. Lots of things influence the decisions that we make, but we make the decisions.
This presents a dilemma. Either God must leave them entirely to their own devices, which contradicts the way most non-Calvinists pray, or he must act upon their hearts, which is the very thing they deny.
We're never left to our own devices. We are living in God's world. We are created by God with agency and the ability to choose. But everywhere around us, God is revealing himself to us, even in the creation itself, Romans chapter 1, verse 20. And so the influence there, God calls us just by living in his world and seeing the beauty of his creation. But I would say further, even the circumstances that we are surrounded by in our lives as unique and varied as they are for each and every one of us, all of those God can use to urge us to consider life and eternity and the offer of Jesus.
The logical inconsistency here is unavoidable. Either God influences the will, making salvation dependent upon his intervention.
Salvation is always dependent upon God's intervention, but not causally determined intervention, or intervention that involves causal determinism. Intervention can be a persuading and urging, and all of these things, and so this does not follow.
Or he does not, leaving the sinner entirely helpless in their sin. Question 2. Are non-Calvinists secret Calvinists or open theists? When it comes to God's foreknowledge, non-Calvinists tend to fall into one of two camps, whether they realize it or not. They either lean towards open theism, denying that God has exhaustive knowledge of the future, or they adopt a position that logically aligns with Calvinism while denying it outwardly. If they claim that God does not know what a person will choose until they actually choose it, then they have embraced open theism, the belief that God's knowledge is limited and subject to time.
I do not hold to open theism, so I do believe that God knows what a person will choose even before he chooses it. This is part of omniscience. God knows what every person will do, and even more than that, God knows what every person would do under any given circumstances, because this is what omniscience entails.
Position is unbiblical and diminishes God's omniscience. On the other hand, if they affirm that God looks down the corridors of time and knows what each person will choose, then they are left with another problem.
Now, he's phrased this in a way I would never phrase it. God looks down the corridors of time and sees what a person would choose. He says that's going to present another problem. And I agree that that does present a problem. That means that God can only know what a person would choose because he has to depend upon that person's choice, that person to make the choice before he can know. But no, God knows before that person is even created because, again, God is omniscient. He knows everyone he could create, and he knows everyone that if he would create them and place them in whatever circumstance, what that person would freely choose to do. It is a fascinating doctrine of omniscience, but it is also necessary for God to have in order to be truly sovereign while allowing human libertarian freedom. That second part is what Calvinism denies. They want to assert God has sovereignty, but they say that means humans cannot have libertarian freedom. And I say a God who is sovereign enough to create humans with genuine libertarian freedom is much more sovereign and powerful and amazing than a God who is unable to do that.
Can the person do other than what God foreknows? If the answer is no, then the choice is fixed and certain.
So here he's touching on what we might call fatalism. If God foreknows what a person will choose, does that mean that person cannot choose differently? So he thinks this shows the impossibility of freedom and God's foreknowledge. And my point is that, well, if that person were to choose differently, then God's foreknowledge would be different. So his foreknowledge does not determine what that free person will choose. It simply knows what that free person will choose. But if that person will choose differently, then God's foreknowledge would be different, and he wouldn't predict or know something false. It's a problem of cause and effect in the Calvinist mind. Calvinism believes that the only way God can foreknow a person's choice is if he determines that choice ultimately, causally determines it. Otherwise, he could not know. God knows the free choices of individuals.
Meaning God's foreknowledge necessitates the outcome.
That's fatalism.
In this case,
not true.
They are inadvertently affirming a form of predestination, making them, in effect, secret Calvinists.
See, that's what Calvinists believe, is that God's foreknowledge necessitates the choice of the individual. And my point is God's foreknowledge doesn't have any causal powers. It's simply knowledge of what the free agent would or will choose. And it doesn't cause the choice, it simply foreknows the choice that is to be made. Calvinists do not accept that truth.
Non-Calvinists cannot have it both ways. Either God knows all things, meaning that human choices are ultimately determined by his sovereign plan,
See?
or he does not know all things.
The only way for God to know all things is if every choice is determined by God. And I deny that.
Which is a denial of his divine nature. Conclusion. The non-Calvinist view of free will creates insurmountable contradictions when examined in light of prayer and divine foreknowledge.
So here he's just recapping his two questions that he believes is insurmountable by a non-Calvinist. And I believe that I have explained that I do not believe that they're insurmountable. In fact, I believe that if Calvinism is true, then the whole effort of putting out a video like this to convince a person to believe is really just an exercise in self-contradiction itself. Because every thought that a human has is determined by God. So not only our choices and our actions determined by God, but our very thoughts and the way that we think and the way that we assess information is all determined by God. And so we really are just going through the motions of freedom, and it seems perhaps to us that we have freedom, but we really don't. We are basically spectators in a grand play that has already been determined by God to play out as it is, and we do not really have any ultimate libertarian freedom to make choices. To me, that is probably the most absurd theological position, biblically speaking, that I could think of. I hope that this has been thought-provoking and something for you to consider whenever you're faced with questions from Calvinists as well.